Adaptation and adaptation policy. I've been talking about adaptation, but I've never talked really about the role of government in adaptation, let alone the role of the United Nations and organizations like that in adaptation. So I talked about adaptation per se. If climate changes, people and companies would change their behavior to either alleviate the negative consequences of climate change or make the most of the positive impacts. Because of adaptation, impacts are not nearly as bad as they otherwise would have been, and there's actually also some cases where the sign of the impacts changes because of adaptation, and I've shown examples of that. Because of adaptation, climate change is not as bad as it otherwise would be, and that implies that there's less need to mitigate emissions, there's less need to reduce emissions. There is, at a broad policy level, adaptation and mitigation are substitutes, not complements. If you do more adaptation, you need to do less mitigation, and if you do more mitigation, you need to do less adaptation. A lot of people get into climate policy because they have some sort of preconceived notion that we should revolutionize the energy sector, we should perhaps revolutionize society. Naomi Klein comes to mind. This changes everything, right? So they use the greenhouse gas emission reduction agenda as a way to fulfill their dreams of world government or their dreams of socialism, things like that. If that is your motivation, and that's actually the motivation of a lot of people in the environmental movement, adaptation is terrible, right? Because adaptation reduces the need to change our ways if it comes to energy use. A lot of people also see adaptation as a defeat, right? We're going to adapt to climate change, and therefore we give up on reducing emissions. And because of that, for a very long time, adaptation was sort of off the policy agenda. Which I actually think is a good thing for reasons that I'll be able to explain over the next 40 minutes or so. And has changed a little bit in the last 10 years or so, when people started realizing that climate policy is less than perfect, right? We cannot avoid climate change completely, and therefore adaptation is necessary. There's another aspect to this, and that is that mitigation, I mean, climate change depends on the emissions of everybody. Climate change is driven by the sum total of global emissions, not by the emissions of any individual household or company or country. And therefore, successful mitigation requires some form of international cooperation, or at least coordination. But successful adaptation does not. If you want to build a dike on the south coast of England, you can build a dike on the south coast of England. You don't need to negotiate with the Americans about that. And with the repeated failures of the international climate negotiations, which are mostly about mitigation, people have begun to realize, well, if we want to minimize the impacts of climate change, then perhaps we should just start doing things ourselves. And because of these things, adaptation is now much higher on the political agenda than it used to be. Before talking about the role of government in adaptation, I'm going to spend a few minutes on the question how to adapt. What is adaptation really? Adaptation is, and I'll give you many examples. Adaptation is often trivial, and it only becomes a difficult problem if we are faced with long-lived infrastructure, and typically this is related to water resources in some way or another. And the main issue is uncertainty. I've shown you this graph, I think, a couple of times now. And essentially, it tells you that by the end of this century, the world will be warmer, perhaps by 1 degree, perhaps by 6 degrees. And that is simply the level of uncertainty that we would have to live with. This is at a global scale. At a local scale, the range of uncertainties is much larger. And if we then focus on rainfall rather than temperature, we see that in large parts of the world where the areas are not shaded, the models cannot even agree on the sign of the change. We know that rainfall will be different in the future, but we don't know whether it will be wetter or drier in the future. We only know that it will be different. And if you're confronted with that sort of uncertainty, then you're in trouble, because you don't really know what to do, right? And this matters only if, say, you're building a dam for irrigation and the dam is supposed to last for the next 100 years. If you're deciding whether or not next year you're going to plant wheat or maize on your fields, then the fact that we don't know what rain will fall in 100 years' time is irrelevant, right? The only thing that matters for your planting decision is how much rain do we expect next growing season. Not in 100 years' time. So for those sort of decisions, the fact that we are very, very uncertain about the future in 100 years' time, like, who cares? But if you're building infrastructure that lasts for so long, you should care. Because if you're a responsible manager, you would hope that the piece of kit that you're putting in place would still do its job at the end of its lifetime, right? So it's only long-lived infrastructure that things become problematic, and particularly when the uncertainty with regard to rainfall, then it becomes really, really difficult to make a proper decision. I mean, in the UK we're now in the discussion what to do with the Thames barrier. The Thames barrier is nearing the end of its lifetime. And it should be replaced over the next 20 years or so. The Thames barrier protects London from flooding, right? There you can argue about what should replace the Thames barrier and how robust should it be to future sea level rise and so on and so forth. There at least the sign is certain. Nobody is arguing that sea level will fall. A lot of people saying that sea level could rise by another by a meter or so. So there the choice is pretty obvious. You should raise whatever's going to replace the Thames barrier with something that is a meter higher, or if you want to be on the safe side, 2 meters higher, right, if you have a lot of money to spend. So there it's, the choice is relatively simple. It's much less so if you're dealing with water systems. Now there's two basic options that you can go for. One is to make the whole system more robust, so that it can withstand more rain and less rain. Just over-engineer it in every dimension. That may seem logical, but it's not necessarily easy. Because if you don't know whether it's going to rain more or less in the future, one solution to the problem of having more floods is to have rivers drain faster. You essentially dredge them, or you may deepen them so that more water flows out. And then the water ends up in the sea where it doesn't do any harm, rather than in people's houses, right? Now, that solution works if you know it's going to rain more. But if a river drains faster in winter time, it will also drain faster in summertime. And that means that if you're going to flush out the water faster, you're also going to have more severe droughts. So you need to come up with a system that sort of stores the water when you need it, but drains the water as fast as you can if you don't need it. So it's not necessarily the case that you want to build a whole system just bigger and more robust because you may be solving one problem rather than another. The thing that you can do, and that's probably advisable, is to avoid. That's what happened. I touched it with my. Is to avoid rigidities in the system. To design the infrastructure such that you can change it. You may think a lot of these things are built of concrete, right? So how do I change that? You walk along some beaches, or for that matter, do it again. You visit Egypt, and we travel around Egypt, then you would see in Egypt is very striking, or at least I find it very striking, is that you see a lot of houses along the roads, and they seem to be half finished. There's people living on the ground floor, there's people living on the first floor, and then you see all these metal wires sticking out. And first time I traveled through Egypt, I wondered, why would they do this? This is ugly, right? And it looks unfinished, and why did they not just finish their building? And the same is true actually if you walk along some coast, you would see these groins and things like that, big pieces of wire sticking out. And you may think this is a health hazard, right? Why would you do this? Why would they not just tidy it up? The reason for that is that if you put a piece of concrete there and you take off the wires, then if you want to make it larger, you essentially need to take away everything and start building again. Whereas if you leave the metal wire stick out, you can pour on new concrete and make it bigger if the need arises. That is the reason why you do it on the coast. For Egyptian houses, it is another form of flexibility. If your son gets married, then you can put an additional floor on your house and let your son and his new wife and the forthcoming kids move in there, right? That is why you want to have a house of flexible size if you're in that sort of family structure. So there are ways of even making concrete systems more flexible. And if you're just uncertain about the future, that is probably a good way of going about things. If you're certain about the size, about the sign of the change, and your piece of infrastructure fulfills one role only, for instance, the Thames barrier and keeping out floods, keeping floods out of London, then you just want to build it bigger, right? Build it as big as you can, or as big as you can afford. And if you're lucky, then you keep out more floods than you had intended, and if you're unlucky, whatever. So if it's too big, then you spend a bit too much money, but you avoid all the floods. If you're unlucky and the worst scenario sort of comes to pass, then you're still safe behind it. So there it's relatively simple. Now, in those cases where infrastructure is short-lived or the decisions have sort of like a lifetime of only a few years or a few months or even a few minutes or a few hours, and then of course, I mean, the system renews itself all the time. I've shown you this picture. These beats will be completely different, or the people on the beach will be completely different the next day, so there you don't need to worry about them drowning because of future sea level rise, right? So, policy. And what role do national and international authorities have in adaptation? I said that people are now beginning to realize that mitigation cannot be perfect, that adaptation is necessary, and this has led national governments across the world to start formulating national adaptation plans. And some of them did it of their own volition. A lot of them are now doing this because they somehow ended up in an international treaty. We've had a series of international negotiations about climate policy since 1995, and they cannot agree on what they're supposed to agree on, that is greenhouse gas emission reduction, but occasionally they do agree on things like this. Everybody shall have an adaptation plan. So that is what they're doing, not to be outdone. Multilateral organizations such as the World Bank and IMF, and also the regional development banks and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and who not, are writing their own adaptation plans. When they were first confronted with this, the question was, of course, oh my God, what is this, right? You have to write a national adaptation plan. So this has led to a bit of a bonanza for consultants to advise them on this. And another thing that was agreed in the international negotiations, agreed in principle rather than by force of law, was that rich countries will finance adaptation in poor countries. The idea is that poor countries are more vulnerable to climate change than the rich countries. Rich countries cause most of the problem, and therefore we have to assist them. And this is not small money. What you're looking at here is a picture in constant 2011 dollars of the annual amount spent on official development aid. And the total is the total. The orange, it's sort of orange, right? Is all the money that is spent on sort of your traditional development aid. In green, we're looking at the money that is spent on greenhouse gas emission reduction in developing countries, paid for by developed countries. And in blue, we're looking at the money that is spent on adaptation. So one thing you immediately noticed is that since 2005 or so, the sum total of official development aid has increased. Actually, sort of your traditional development aid has fallen slightly, and all the additional money is in fact money that is spent on climate policy. And adaptation is taking an increasing share of that, and it now totals something like 10 million. Do I say that correctly? Yeah, $10 million per year. Climate money is now about a fifth, maybe slightly less of the total of development aid. Right? More and more money is moved away from education for girls, for instance, or healthcare towards solar panels and seawalls. Whether that money well spent is a different story, but this is a substantial sum of money, and it's growing all the time. And going back to the Grunsberg example on the beach, you may ask yourself, why? Are they all involved? Isn't adaptation private? Isn't it in my own best interest that if climate changes, I would change my behavior or the technology that I use or whatever? If a farmer used to plant wheat, now climate is changing, and perhaps it's best to change to a different cultivar of wheat, or perhaps to barley, or perhaps to maize. Can't farmers sort it out for himself what to plant? Damn, that's the wrong question, right? I talked about adaptive capacity. That is not to say that there's no role for the government, right? So let's talk about heat waves for a bit. So if it's very hot outside, what do? No, you should not put on a lot of clothes, right? So if it gets warmer, you should take off your winter coat and put on your summer coat, and if it gets very, very warm, you should perhaps not wear a coat. And you should start wearing shorts, right? Now, that is not something that we need to tell people, right? In fact, we would be rather surprised if David Cameron puts his head on television and said, because, or if the person who does the weather for the BBC, they're on strike at the moment, sort of says it's going to be warm tomorrow, perhaps you should not wear your winter coat, right? We would be very, very surprised if somebody says that. That's a purely private decision. If you have little kids, you should tell them, because little kids don't know this, but as soon as sort of they get above the age of 5, then they can sort of figure this out for themselves, right? It's hot, you should stay calm, you should keep out of the sun. That's something you should tell English people, right? It's hot, stay out of the sun. But it's sort of self-evident, you should drink lots when it's warm because you sweat a lot, but you should not drink alcohol that much, because that actually closes your pores and makes your cooling system less effective. So all these things are some things that your mother or your father or whoever raised you should have told you, right? And it's purely private, and the government has no role to play. Some of these decisions are actually collective decisions rather than public decisions. So in very warm places, people adapted to that by sleeping through the hottest hours of the day. Which actually physiologically makes a lot of sense. It's cooler at night, or in the evening, so you should do more work in the evening and less, say between 12 and 2. Now siestas are easier when all your neighbors have a siesta too, right? And also when your work allows you to do this. And so there is a form, and there's a coordination problem too. Ditto for late dinners. Physiologically, it makes a lot of sense if it's very hot, that you don't eat your main meal during the hottest period of the day, but you do it at 10 in the evening or at midnight, which again is a coordination problem that's easier to do if sort of the whole day is organized around this. If restaurants stay open or after 10 or something like that. That is a coordination problem, right? And the role that the government has in all this is really one, perhaps, of running an awareness campaign if things change very rapidly and people don't realize these things or have forgotten about these things. But there's really nothing that you can write down in a piece of legislation that people should not wear their winter coats after the 1st of March or something like that. It's just pointless, right? This is not to say that there's no role for government, right? Because the government sort of intrudes on many things, including things that perhaps should not intrude on. I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of what happened during heat waves that do call for some form of public involvement in all this. So in 2003 there was a major heat wave in Europe. It was concentrated in France. Always very hard to pin numbers on this, but people reckon that between 40 and 45,000 people died during this heat wave. Which is quite substantial, right? And perhaps something you want to avoid. And a lot of that actually had to do with failures of the public health system. And the heat wave happened during August, and August is the traditional holiday month in France, other parts of Southern Europe as well. So a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses were on holiday. A lot of health bureaucrats were on holiday as well. And the Minister for Health was on holiday. Minister for Health, because this was an unexpected event, they'd never experienced anything before, so there were no procedures in place to call the nurses and the doctors and the other officials back from holidays. Simply nobody had the authority in France to call them back, even though they are emergency workers, so in principle their contract can force them to come back, but there was nobody to make the decision. And the minister, who did have the authority, was the only person that has the authority, was on holiday as well and decided not to read French newspapers while on holiday because he was on holiday, right? And nobody thought of calling the minister back from holiday. So because of that, a lot of people could have been saved had there been proper medical care, but the medical care wasn't there. The skeleton staff in hospitals was overwhelmed by all this, and a lot of people died unnecessarily because the minister was on holiday, right? This is an obvious public failure, right? They've sort of learned from this, and they now have a proper heat wave plan in place that takes this eventuality into consideration, right? One thing you can do when it's very hot is to go a place with air conditioning. And in many areas, the only places that are properly air conditioned in sort of public access are shopping malls. And what you see during heat waves is that vulnerable people sort of congregate in shopping malls and just sit around. Now, security personnel is under very strict orders to remove people from shopping malls if they're not there to shop. Security personnel is typically not the best educated. You can't really reason with them. They follow rules and that's it. And if the rules say either you're in the shopping mall and shop or you're not in the shopping mall, there have been many instances of people who were seeking to cool off in a shopping mall were just forcibly removed, and some of them subsequently died from heat stroke. Again, the response is pretty simple, right? You need to come up with a heat wave protocol that would allow elderly people to stay in shopping malls during if it's a particular temperature. You just need to change the rule and inform the security personnel. And there may be a role for the government. This is actually an American example, not a European example. Another American example, actually from Chicago, heat waves in the late 1990s. Or the late 1980s. Now I'm just unsure. What they discovered, they sort of had a heat wave. 500 people died in the course of a few days, and they went in and they examined what was going on, and they interviewed the survivors and wondered what had happened here. And there was two things that happened, right? They found people essentially boiled to death, sitting in their room with all their windows closed. And the question was, why did you not just open your window, right, so that a little bit of fresh air could come in? The answer was that people were so afraid of all the thugs and the thieves that were on the street that they would rather risk death than the certainty of somebody breaking into their house. So what do you want to do there? Again, a public response. You want to send more police officers onto the streets during heat waves. That's actually a very good idea anyway, because a lot of statistics show that during heat waves, which, as I said, I think on Monday morning, heat waves put a lot of stress on the body. That means that people get very cranky. You may recall that from your own experience. And as a result, violent crime goes up during heat waves, and quite considerably. Both sexual violence and just violence, sexual violence and just ordinary violence, beating people up and that sort of stuff. It's just a lot of things get out of hand during very hot days. So you want to have more people, more police on the street. It would also help against this sort of problems. They also discovered that some people were just boiling in their room. They did have a fan, but they never turned the fan on because they could not afford the electricity. So one solution there, that during heat waves you may want to give out vouchers to vulnerable people for free electricity, right? So that they at least can afford to turn on their fan rather than boil to death. So here there's a clear mix, because the government is so important in the security apparatus and in the provision of public health and the provision of healthcare, that there's a clear mix of private and public intervention. Right? In other cases, it's actually that simple, right? Coastal protection is a public good. In the UK, flood control is the provenance of England and Wales together, Scotland separately, Northern Ireland separately, but it is a public duty, right? And that is true for most countries around the world, that the exception of a few states in the US, that if you want to build a dike, you actually cannot build a dike. The county council or the national government or somebody has to build this dike for you, right? And that's for very good reason. I mean, if you own a plot of land and sea level is rising and you build a dike in front of your land but your neighbors don't, then the water just comes around the dike and it's not very effective. So you should build a dike all around your land, which is way more expensive than just building a linear dike on the coast, right? So that is for a very good reason that coastal protection is a public good. Things related to agriculture are also often seen as public goods, even though they are not really. Irrigation is a good example, even though irrigation is essentially a shared or a collective good for farmers. We often see it as a public good. We want taxpayers' money to be invested in that. And for reasons that are beyond me, agriculture extension is also often seen as a public good, even in avowedly capitalist countries like the United States. For some reason, the taxpayer pays for advice to farmers on what to plant, when to fertilize, when to spray, and so on and so forth. And of course, if climate is changing, then the advice that you give to farmers, what to plant, when to harvest, that advice should change as well. The crop calendar should be adjusted. And if the crop calendars are a public duty, then this falls on the government to change. Right? Same is true for building standards and those sort of things. If you expect more wind, then you want stronger roofs, and the strength of roofs is largely determined by the building standards. So adaptation is really a mix of public and private. Talking through all this, there's still no role for the United Nations, right? It's still pretty unclear what Ban Ki-moon has to do with any of it. There's also examples where the government actually gets in the way of adaptation. And the best examples there are from agriculture. In Europe, we have quite generous subsidies for farmers. A very small proportion of the population, a very small proportion of the workforce has a very small proportion of GDP and a fairly large proportion of public spending. And if you look closely at the subsidies for agriculture in Europe, then they serve two purposes. One is to reduce the regional differences in rewards for farmers, and the second is to reduce price volatility and reduce income volatility. So the regional structure of the subsidies is really, we want every farmer in Europe to have roughly the same income. So a farmer who is growing things that are completely and totally inappropriate on soils that are completely unsuitable and therefore makes very little money gets a larger subsidy than a farmer who does ultimately sensible things on fertile soils. So we disproportionately reward small-scale farmers, we disproportionately reward farmers who work on soils that are mostly made of stone rather than of humus. We disproportionately reward farmers that work in very harsh climates and therefore nothing much grows there. And then whenever there's a bad year, whenever there's a bad harvest, whenever there's a bad harvest for a particular crop, subsidies go up, right? So that farmers' incomes are roughly kept equal. The implication of all this is that you mute the signal that perhaps what the farmer is doing is not the most sensible thing to do. So in a scenario of climate change, if a particular crop is failing, then you would want the private actor to realize that perhaps this was a bad choice of crop and perhaps I should switch to something else. Well, because the subsidies compensate for the loss, the farmer doesn't feel the signal and therefore has less reason to change behavior or change crops, right? The subsidies mute the market signal. So that works through the system of compensating subsidies in Europe. Internationally, it also works. because we still have fairly high trade barriers for agricultural products, which also means that if a certain crop doesn't want to grow in Europe anymore, and really we should grow it in the United States or in Africa or wherever, that signal gets lost by protection measures with international trade. And all of this locks farmers, not locks is perhaps a bit too strong, sort of seduces farmers to keep doing whatever they've been doing. Whereas in fact, because of the climate has changed, you want them to do something differently. That's it for today. I'll see you guys next week. It doesn't want to stop.